So last week, Moses got a response from God. And basically God says, Moses, this is who I am. I'm the Almighty God who appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I'm a covenant-keeping God who's remembered my promise that I made to Abraham of land, of offspring, of blessing. I will keep my promises. So when he directs Moses to direct his attention to something, he says, direct your attention to who I am. And then secondly, Moses, direct your attention to what I've called you to do. So that we as a people, when we're called into mission, when we're called to obedience to God, that oftentimes will result in opposition, it will result in fear, it will result in things that will want to war against your obedience, against moving forward, against faith in God. And so on those days in which there's opposition and there's a tendency to fall back on the mission, to retreat a little bit, that we have to draw our focus to who God is and what he's called us to do. Moses was facing opposition from Pharaoh, and he was facing opposition from the Israelite people, and God says, Moses, focus on me, focus what I've called you to do. And so that's where we left Moses. And now in chapter 7, the Lord said to Moses, verse 1, see, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet. I just lost my place. You shall speak all that, verse 2, you shall speak all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall tell Pharaoh to let the people of Israel go out of this land. Now we have a difficult verse in verse 3. But this isn't the first time that this statement's come up. God says to Moses, I will harden Pharaoh's heart. I will do this. So God has already said this before. Moses perhaps forgot it. But God says, Moses, tell Pharaoh to let the Israelite people go, but be prepared for the fact that I am going to harden Pharaoh's heart. This will happen. And you have to do something with that, because you can't just ignore the fact that God says, I'm going to take Pharaoh, and I'm going to use him, who's a wicked, sinful man, and I am going to make his hard heart so that he will not listen, so that he will not obey. So verse 3, I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and though I multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt, Pharaoh will not listen to you. He's not going to do it. So we go on. Then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring my hosts, my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great acts of judgment. So follow very closely. God says, I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and then the means by which I will deliver the people and keep my covenantal promises to them is by great acts of kindness. It's not what he says, is it? Great acts of mercy. It's not there, is it? Great acts of what? Great acts of judgment. How many of you like the fact that by and large we live in a society that tries to arrest and prosecute criminals? How many of you like that about? Okay, yeah. It's nice when you call the police and they show up, right? It's not the case in every country, right? If you've traveled around the world or you've talked with people who lived in other parts of the world, you can call the police and they may or they may not show up. It's kind of like take a number, get in line, and if they show up, you're not really convinced that they're going to do anything because of the corruption. Now, I'm not saying we don't have corruption in our society and within our... We do, okay? All right. It's a sinful world. But by and large, I would rather live in our country with the law enforcement that we have, although not perfect. We try to take seriously acts of crime, and when men and women hurt and injure other men and women, that we would go after them, that we would pursue them, that we would arrest them, that they would do what? That they would be brought before a what? A judge and judged and sentenced, right? It makes us angry when someone who has done a crime isn't judged and isn't sentenced, doesn't that make us angry? Why? Because ingrained within us is a sense of justice, isn't there? That if you do wrong, if you violate the law, you must pay the penalty or pay the price for violating the law. This is why when we tell stories or we watch movies, right, and the bad guy, like by the end of the movie, you want what? You want the bad guy to get beaten, right? You want him to get taken down by the hero. And we love that. My wife and I were watching a movie last night, and there was a really, really bad guy in it. And a good movie will make and a good actor will make that villain just make you want to hate him, right? And this movie, I was like, oh yeah, get him, and they got him. And I was like, yes. Like that's ingrained in us, right? The sense of justice, the sense of judgment against the wrongdoers, like that's a part of who we are. So then why do we have such a problem as a society when God displays his justice and his judgment? Why is that so hard to talk about? The fact that God would be angry toward sin and toward the sinner. That's right, I said toward the sinner. See, this isn't something we can sugarcoat. The Bible is very clear that God has wrath and anger toward the sin and toward the sinner. That the wrath of God is upon those who are in their sin. Those who have violated God's law sit underneath the wrath of God. This was Pharaoh. That he sits underneath the wrath. Now this doesn't mean that there's not love and mercy. We will get there. But someone in their sin sits underneath the wrath of a holy God because of God's holiness, because of God's justice. They sit underneath the curse or the wrath of a holy God. And God is a God who takes sin very seriously, and God is a God who judges sin. And so what we're going to see from this text is that God's sovereign acts of judgment display his glory. Let me say that again. God's sovereign acts of judgment display his glory. See, to talk about a God who judges and a God of wrath is not particularly popular in today's culture, is it? Why? Because we want a God who will simply just dismiss sin. We want a God who will overlook our sin. We want a God who will not deal with our sin. But let me tell you, to talk about a God who only offers forgiveness and mercy to the neglect of talking about a God who judges sin is to remove an aspect of the character and nature of God that makes him glorious. Let me put it this way. If God does not judge and deal harshly with sin, then there is no need for love and forgiveness and mercy, is there? Sin has to be dealt with. We are violators of God's law. Pharaoh was a violator of God's law. And the holiness of God mandates that the price for sin or the penalty for sin be handed out. And that's what? That is death. So God says, violate my law. Back in the garden, disobey, the judgment for sin is death. So God judges and deals with sin. He does not dismiss it. And by the way, I love a God who hates sin. I love a God who looks at murder and rape and all of the things that destroy lives. I love a God who looks at that and says, that is wrong and I hate it. I love a holy God who hates sin. I love a God who doesn't just allow sin to just go without being judged. I love a just, righteous, and holy judge. I love that. The problem and the reason it is hard for us to accept or talk about God as a just judge is because of what? The fact that we are the guilty party. Right? We can watch the movie and the guy who's murdering innocent people gets caught and captured and beat up or whatever. Like, we love that, right? Why? Because he's a dirtbag. He's a murderer. He's a thief. He's bad, but not me. I'm not like him. But if we evaluate ourselves in light of God's law, we are the guilty party who deserve what? The judgment of God. And God's judgment of sin, his sovereign act of judging sin, does reveal his glory. And we're going to see that as we continue in Exodus chapter 7. Verse 6, we continue reading. Moses and Aaron did so. So now we have them obeying. Okay, God, we're going to do it. So they go before Pharaoh. They did so. They did just as the Lord commanded them. Now Moses was 80 years old and Aaron 83 years old when they spoke to Pharaoh. And that's just kind of a side note in the text, which I love that that's there because it's like they were old. How many of you are 80 or older? Raise your hand. Like, it's okay to, like, once you hit 80, I think you can be proud of that, right? Like, I made it to 80. Anything below, I ain't giving out my age, but once you made it to 80, like, yeah, like, I own that. That's awesome, okay? But once you hit 80, I'm told you tend to slow down a little bit, some of you, maybe. You're not as fast as you used to be, not as energetic as you once were, so I hear. But God still had a plan for Moses and Aaron in their 80s. And I love that God was saying, no, Moses, right now you're the man, 80 years old. Accomplish the task I've called you to do. And it's not going to be an easy one. Verse 8, then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, when Pharaoh says to you, prove yourself by working a miracle, then you shall say to Aaron, take your staff and cast it down before Pharaoh so that it may become a serpent. So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did just as the Lord commanded. Aaron cast down his staff before Pharaoh and his servants, and it became a serpent. Then Pharaoh summoned the wise men and the sorcerers and the magicians of Egypt also, and they did the same by their secret arts. For each man cast down his staff, and they became serpents. But Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. Still Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them as the Lord had said. So we do the little staff thing, right? So Moses, what's in your hand? It's a staff. We're going to use that. So he throws it down. It becomes a serpent, right? Woo, okay, we saw that. Moses back in the desert, we saw that, right? Well, okay, so the magicians of Pharaoh, who through their dark, demonic witchcraft, really, they do the same thing. Their staffs, through the power, I believe, of Satan, become serpents. But what's proven here is that Moses' serpent takes and devours the serpents of the men of Pharaoh. But still Pharaoh's heart is hardened. God's doing this. Then the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is hardened. Well, yeah, okay, we get that, God, you've done that. He refuses to let the people go. So it's interesting in this text because God's hardening Pharaoh's heart, and then God's saying he's refusing to let the people go. Go to Pharaoh in the morning. As he is going out to the water, stand on the bank of the Nile to meet him, and take in your hand a staff, the staff that turned into a serpent, and you shall say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, sent me to you, saying, let my people go, so that they may serve me in the wilderness. But so far you have not obeyed. You have not obeyed. Thus says the Lord, by this you shall know that I am the Lord. Behold, the staff that is in my hand, I will strike the water that is in the Nile, and it shall turn to blood. Now, what we have to understand here are a couple of things. First of all, God exercises his sovereign authority to reveal who he is. So I want to deal with this statement that God hardened Pharaoh's heart and why God was doing this. So is God sovereign? And by that question, I mean, does God have the power and the authority to ordain the acts and the actions of men? Does he or not? Yes, he does. God has the power and the authority to act and interact, and does God have the right and the authority to take a man like Pharaoh and to harden his heart, ultimately so that God can accomplish his purposes? Does God have the authority to do that? The answer is yes. If you go to Romans chapter 9, the Apostle Paul actually hits on this. And I think it's always very, very necessary to, when you see a New Testament text referencing an Old Testament text, that what we do is we interpret the Old Testament in light of the New Testament. We interpret the Old Testament in light of what Christ has fulfilled. And so if you go to Romans chapter 9, Paul's engaging in a conversation or in his letter with the Romans, and he's talking about the sovereignty of God and God's choice and God's power. And notice what he says in verse 17. For the scripture says to Pharaoh, now notice this. Notice the language of Paul. For this very purpose I have raised you up. What was the purpose to which God raised up Pharaoh and hardened his heart? That I might show what? My power in you. My power in who? My power in Pharaoh. And that why? The second thing, that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. So he hardened Pharaoh's heart for two reasons. We know that from Romans chapter 9, that God sovereignly took a man, he hardened his heart so that his power would be revealed and so that his name would be proclaimed. That God took a man who was sinful and wicked, a man who was blasphemous and rebellious, and God says, I'm going to proclaim my power and my name through him. Through judging him, through judging his land and judging his people. You see, if God does not harden Pharaoh's heart, and Moses comes in and says, let the people go, and Pharaoh says, okay, a couple of things could happen. Either Moses is applauded as an incredible leader who convinced Pharaoh to let the people go. Yay, Moses. Or Pharaoh is applauded as a compassionate, loving, deliverer. Yay, Pharaoh. And God says, I'm going to display my power. I'm going to proclaim my name. I will reveal myself so that the Egyptians will know, so that the Israelites will know that I am God, that I am the great I am. See, the reality is, if you know anything about the Egyptian religious system, they literally had thousands of gods that they worshiped. Thousands. They had a God for everything. And so what Yahweh wanted to come in and do was to proclaim that none of those gods exist. None of them are real. Pharaoh himself, who claimed to be God, is not a God. And even he will fall under my judgment. And I will show the Egyptians and I will show the Israelites that there is one God. And his name is Yahweh. And he alone has power. And I will proclaim this through the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, through his rebellion, through his blasphemy. I will show my power and I will show my name. And so the reality is this: God will take your circumstances, good or bad, and use them sovereignly to reveal himself to you. Is it possible that God could take our sin, our rebellion, our mistakes, our weaknesses, and even through that reveal himself to us? Is that possible? The answer is yes. In fact, some of you, if I could call you up here to share a testimony of how that would happen, if I were just to open it up and say, tell of a time how your failure, in your weakness, in your brokenness, God showed up and revealed himself to you. We could probably share story after story after story of times where God sovereignly used even the negative, even our own mistakes, even our rebellion, to reveal himself to us. And this is what God's doing here in this text. I'm going to take Pharaoh. I'm going to harden his heart. I'm going to judge him. And in that, I'm going to show that I'm great and that I'm powerful and that there's none like me. And so then we have chapters 8, 9, and 10. And if you're familiar with the Bible and you grew up in Sunday school, what we have the 10 Egyptian plagues. If you go to chapter 9, verse 14, I want you to notice a statement here. God sends these plagues. First of all, he turns the Nile River into blood. Now you think about what that would do to the region that's dependent upon the Nile River. It kills the fish. It removes a water source that's vital for living. It probably creates chaos and panic, disease and death. This was the first plague. And so God looks at the rebellion and the sin of Pharaoh, which you have to do something with the fact that God hardened his heart. And yet Pharaoh still has responsibility before God that he rebels against God. Romans 9, if you want to delve into that a little more, Paul discusses that deeper in Romans 9. But that there is a sovereign God who enters into our situations and our circumstances, and he looks at the situation of Egypt, and he says, what you're doing is wrong. And he judges them, turns the Nile River into blood, and decimates so much of their economy, and decimates so much of their water supply and their source, and creates a deep, deep need for water. And then he sends frogs. Like, why? Like, you ever wonder, like, why frogs? Like, how many of you are like reptile people? You're like, I love, like you want to wake up with frogs in your bed? Right? You want to wait, like, everywhere, open up the cupboard, and they're jumping out. Like, no. And then when they die by the hundreds and thousands, how many of you have ever had one dead animal in your house and you couldn't find it, right? The smell is terrible. Like, what is that? And then you find a mouse that's been there for a few weeks, or you can't find it. Imagine thousands of dead animals. So why frogs? What God was doing through the Egyptian judgments was he was showing, as I said earlier, that he was God. Remember how I said the Egyptians had a God for everything? Would you believe me if I said they had a frog God? Because they did. I mean, literally had the frog god. And so basically, Yahweh, the God of heaven, is saying, there's no frog god. I control my creation. I govern. I lead. I'm sovereign over them. And so what you're going to find throughout these Egyptian judgments, throughout these plagues, is God displaying his power by ceremonially beating down all the gods of the Egyptians. Not all of them, because there are hundreds, but ceremonially saying, there is no frog god. Unless you believe that there's only one God who controls all of creation. And so God will ceremonially just kind of beat down these gods of the Egyptians. Unless the Israelites were falling into some of the pagan idol worship of the Egyptians, Yahweh is sitting there saying, through my sovereign authority, I will judge, and in my judgment, I will show that there is no other God but me. And that's what he's doing through these 10 plagues. He's showing that there is only one God, and it's Yahweh. There's no God of the frogs. There's no God of the gnats. He sends gnats. He sends flies. Okay? Now we've all been in situations where, the bugs, you ever been out camping or whatever, and we were camping up in the Poconos a couple weeks ago, and it rained really hard one night, and we came out the next morning, there were mosquitoes and flies everywhere. You couldn't sit outside. That's nothing compared to what happened here. With the gnats and the flies that God sent to Egypt, it decimated the land. I mean, completely, more than just a minor irritation. It decimated the land. But in verse 14 of chapter 9, when God sends the frogs, notice what he says here. For this time I will send my plagues on you yourself and on your servants and your people. Why? Here's the important reason. I will do this so that you may know that there is none like me in all the earth. Verse 29 of the same chapter. Moses said to him, as soon as I have gone out of the city, I will stretch out my hands to the Lord. The thunder will cease and there will be no more hail. So this is after a hailstorm that God sends to destroy the crops and the land. The thunder will cease, and there will be no more hail, so that why? So that you may know that the earth is the Lord's. So God sends the gnats, the flies. If you go to chapter 8, verse 19. I know I'm kind of going back and forth here. But I want you to see this verse, because there's keys in this text. Up until this point, the frogs, the gnats, the magicians of Pharaoh were able to replicate a lot of the same things. At what level, we don't know. But the snake, the staff turning into snake, the water to blood, the frogs, the gnats, the Egyptian magicians were able to replicate many of these things, which is interesting. As if to say, there is a frog god. There is a god of the flies. But notice verse 19 of chapter 8. Then the magician said to Pharaoh after the gnats, "This is the finger of God." So he brought the magicians of Pharaoh to the point where they said, this is something bigger than us. This is something more powerful than us. This is something beyond what we're able to do. This is the finger of God. So that what God was doing was God was showing and proving what? What the text has been saying, that He is God and that He alone rules the earth. And that God, through His sovereign act of judging one after another, He's proving and showing that through His judgment, He is God and there is none beside Him. God kills the livestock. I mean, they just drop over dead. Now, if you're dependent upon your livestock for food, for farming, and God destroys your livestock, what does that do to your country? What does that do to your economy? It destroys it. God inflicted them with boils. God then inflicted the Egyptians with these boils so that their skin broke out with these painful boils. So God, and listen, throughout the story, what you'll find is Pharaoh saying, "No, I will not. No, I will not." Things get really bad, and what happens? Pharaoh says, "Okay, I will," and then changes his mind. "Okay, I will." No. Why? His heart continues to get hardened, and as a result, his people suffer. He suffers, and God is continuing to say, "I will judge your rebellion. I will judge you for your wickedness. I will judge you. I will judge you." And so God is pouring out judgment upon the land of Egypt, and in so, He is displaying His glory. That God, through His sovereign act of judging, does display His glory. That when God judges sin, He reveals who He is, that He's a just, holy, righteous God who deals with sin. God sends the hailstorm. God sends the locusts. Now, if you've ever read anything about, particularly in the Arab nations in northern Egypt, when a swarm of locusts come in, it looks like a cloud coming in. And when they come in, they eat everything. They destroy everything. God is bringing Egypt to its knees because of the rebellion of Pharaoh. One of the main gods of the Egyptian peoples was the sun god Ra. And we find in chapter 10, verse 21, the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand toward heaven, that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt, a darkness to be felt." So Moses stretched out his hand toward heaven, and there was pitch darkness in all the land of Egypt 3 days. They did not see one another, nor did anyone rise from his place for 3 days, but all the people of Israel had light where they lived. Then Pharaoh called Moses and said, "Go, serve the Lord. Your little ones also may go with you. Only let your flocks and your herds remain behind." But Moses said, "You must also let us have sacrifices and burnt offerings, what we may sacrifice to the Lord. Our livestock must go with us. Not a hoof shall be left behind, for we must take them to serve the Lord our God, and we do not know with what we must serve the Lord until we arrive there." But the Lord, look at this, verse 27, but the Lord Yahweh did what? He hardened Pharaoh's heart. In his sovereign authority over his creation, he takes her and he hardens his heart even more that he would not let them go. Then Pharaoh said to them, "Get away from me. Take care never to see my face again. For on the day you see my face, you shall die." And Moses says, "As you say, I will not see your face again." And that's where we're going to leave it this week. Painting a picture of a God who does judge sin. A God who will deal justly and righteously with those who have blasphemed and disobeyed his law. But I want to point you toward next week. Because God sovereignly displayed his highest glory. When he poured out his wrath on his own son. You see, God cannot simply allow sin to go unpunished. His holiness and his justice dictate that he has to judge sin. Does that make sense? God simply can't overlook your sin and dismiss it. Else he would not be just. He can't simply just let the condemned go free. There is no justice in that, is there? Sin must be paid for. Justice must be meted out. So a holy God that judges sin is right and just and holy. But God's greatest glory, his deepest glory is revealed when he takes his wrath that should have been poured out on you and should have been poured out on me. And on a cross 2,000 years ago, he empties the cup of his wrath upon his perfect, holy, righteous Son, so that those of us who are guilty and those of us who have blasphemed the name of God and violated his law do not sit underneath his wrath, but by faith in his Son, we sit underneath his favor and his blessing, not because we've kept the law, but because Jesus kept it for us and he stood in our place. And what should have been ours, the anger and the wrath of a holy God, fell upon Jesus that day on the cross. And so is God and his character and his name revealed through his pouring out of wrath? Yes, but no greater than when he poured it out on his Son, so that those of us who are guilty can now receive his grace. But you know what? That's next week. Because those of us who deserve the wrath of God, and we do, those of us who are under the curse of sin, we need a substitute. We need a lamb, a perfect lamb. You see, if God is holy, if he's holy, without sin, and just, he must and will judge the world for sin and rebellion. See, to say the God of the Old Testament is different than the God of the New Testament is wrong. The God of the New Testament, if you read the book of Revelation, sends acts of judgment upon the sinful men and women in the same way that we actually see him sending acts of judgment upon Egypt. If you look at some of the seal and trumpet judgments in the book of Revelation, a lot of them mirror the plagues of Egypt. That there's a day coming when the Son of God himself, according to Revelation and the imagery there, the white horse, the tattoo on his thigh, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He will come, and that is a day of judgment for those who don't know him, that God is a God of judgment. I know that sounds harsh, and I know that's not real popular in today's culture, and it's difficult to admit that's what we deserve. But what I would direct you toward is Ephesians chapter 2, where the Apostle Paul says, and you were dead in your trespasses and sin. In which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, that's Satan, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, and were by nature children of what? Children of wrath. To talk about a God of mercy and forgiveness without mentioning that he's a God of wrath is to miss the very essence and character and the nature of the holiness and justice of God. A God who shows wrath towards sin now makes it possible through Christ to experience his favor and his blessing. How is God's glory seen in his sovereign judgment of sinners? So if his glory is seen in his sovereign judgment of sinners, how is that possible? Because judgment of sin seems so negative, but how is God's glory seen when he judges sin? First of all, his holiness is revealed. He is a holy God. Apart from sin, he cannot allow sin into his presence, and he must judge it. When people say, how could a loving God allow that to happen? Our response is this. So when people, how could that happen? How could a loving God do that or allow that? First of all, he is a just God, and we are not innocent. We're not. This was us. We're guilty. Secondly, his justice is revealed. He takes sin seriously, and he will justly judge it. He doesn't just overlook it. A judge who does not justly judge sin is a wicked judge. But lastly, and this is where it all points to, in his judgment of sinners, his mercy and grace is revealed. Because Ephesians doesn't end there. It says this, those of you who were children of wrath, sitting under his judgment, that was us. God rich in what? In mercy. Because of the great what? Love with which he loved us. Even when we were dead in our trespasses, he did what? He made us alive. He brought us to life. He rescued us together with Christ. By grace, you have been saved. So a God who showed wrath towards sin showed it and poured it out on his son so that you could be saved, so that you could experience his favor and his blessing. Why? So that in the coming ages he might show the immeasurable riches of what? His grace in kindness toward Christ Jesus. So what is it that God wants to emphasize through all of eternity? His judgment and his wrath? Or according to Ephesians, his what? His mercy and his love toward you and toward me. Therein I argue that God's greatest glory is displayed when he pours out his wrath on his own son so that we could experience his love. So that when we say God's glory is revealed in the sovereign act of judging men and women, we can see that one, his holiness is revealed. Two, his justice is seen. And three, his mercy is experienced. And his mercy is experienced because those of us who have faith in Christ do not sit under his wrath. Why? Because he poured his wrath on his son. This is the God we serve. And Exodus paints a clear, whole picture of the God we serve. A God who judges sin. And because he judges sin, he provides a rescue so that we don't have to experience his judgment. So that At the end of the day, the message we proclaim is this: men and women are dead in their trespasses and sin. We're rebellious, we're blasphemous, we're sinners. We are the guilty party, sitting under the wrath of God, deserving the judgment of God. But God, being rich in mercy, with the great love with which he loved us, poured out his wrath on his Son so that we could receive his love, his mercy, his acceptance. And this is our message. This is at the center of who we are as a church. It's the gospel. It's the good news. That you won't just have a better life, but that you can be removed from the curse, that you can be delivered from the wrath of God. And you can be a recipient of his mercy and his grace.